South Pacific, 1943. The struggle for the Solomon Islands has become a grinding war of attrition. It is a battle fought over vast stretches of open ocean and steaming jungle islands, where the heat and malaria are enemies as deadly as the Japanese Zeros. In this theater, victory depends on air superiority, and the United States Marine Corps is throwing a new breed of fighter into the fray. To conquer these skies, American industry produced a machine of terrifying power, the Vought F4U Corsair. To the enemy, it is the whistling death. To the Marines who fly it, it is the ensign eliminator, a beast that demands respect. Its distinctive inverted gull-wing design was born of necessity, not aesthetics. The engineers needed to mount the largest propeller ever attached to a fighter plane, and the bent wings provided the necessary ground clearance without requiring landing gear that was too long and fragile for carrier decks. It is a paradox of aviation history that this very design feature, intended for Navy carriers, initially made the aircraft too difficult to land on a moving deck. The long nose blocked the pilot's view, and the landing gear had a tendency to bounce. Rejected by the Navy for carrier duty, the Corsair found its home with the land-based Marines. Here, on crushed coral runways carved out of the jungle, the 2,000-horsepower double Wasp engine could finally be unleashed. But a machine is only as good as the men who fly it, and in the chaotic reinforcement shuffle of the Pacific War, a unique unit was forged. Assembled from replacements, pool pilots, and veterans who had no squadron to call their own, they were a scratch unit. They did not fit the mold of the polished parade ground officers. They were rugged, independent, and led by a commander who was decades older than most of his men, a man who had already flown and fought with the Flying Tigers in China before America even entered the war. These men lived in tents, fought in the air, and survived on sheer grit. They developed tactics that utilized the Corsair's blistering speed and dive performance to counter the agile Japanese fighters. They flew long, exhausting fighter sweeps, often outnumbered, relying on teamwork and aggression to clear the skies from Rabaul to Bougainville. What you are about to see is the record of that time. It is a look at the machinery of war and the human spirit that drives it. From the roar of the radial engines on a tropical morning to the desperate dogfights high above the clouds, this is the story of how a group of so-called misfits became one of the most effective fighting forces in the history of naval aviation.
From September 1943 to January 1944, the Black Sheep Squadron flew bold and highly successful operations in the skies above the Solomon Islands. Under the leadership of the colorful Major Gregory Boyington, the Black Sheep Squadron earned quite a reputation for their distinctive style and impressive record.
Pilots live a different kind of a life. They're not on the beach, Omaha Beach, with bodies all around them. They go out on a mission, and when they come home, they count the people who come back, and you got an empty bunk. But it's a lonely experience, and it happens.
It's hard to describe, how close you are to your buddies out there. And then when somebody didn't come back, it used to upset me that they'd go to his bunk and distribute his toothpaste and shaving gear and all that stuff like, oh, yeah, he's gone.
By noon on January 3rd, 1944, he was missing in action. As one report stated, the war stood still for 100 pilots and 500 crewmen. Everybody, including the press, waited for the return of Marine Corps Major Gregory Boyington. Boyington was only 1 kill away from tying the United States all-time ace record. Could someone have bettered Boyington? What would the Black Sheep do without Pappy?
He wasn't a role model on the ground, but I thought he was a role model in the air. Yeah, he made young men brave. He was a real leader in the air.
How many pilots have you ever heard of who on their first combat mission in the Solomon Islands, where we were, shot down 5 planes on one mission?
His leadership wasn't only morale, but tactically he was a very fine leader and inspiration with his own conduct in combat. He had all these frailties that go with being an alcoholic, but he was to us, he was a fine squadron commander.
He even gave a talk to them one time and said, look, I'm just like a coach, and this is a big football team, and we all got to work together to make this thing happen. And I think that was what inspired them most of all, just because he was a down-to-earth person and basically led by example in the airplane.
They came from everywhere, from New England to New Orleans, from Florida to California. They had never trained together. In fact, no one planned to put them together. These were Boyington's bastards, Pappy's black sheep. The Black Sheep Fighter Squadron and their speedy Corsairs tormented the Japanese in the Solomon Islands. The squadron is credited with 126 destroyed, with another 34 probable, all of this in just 12 weeks. The squadron's success started at the top with their unusual squadron leader. He was raised Gregory Hallenbeck, born on December 4th, 1912. His home was a small lumber town in western Idaho. Living in a frontier community with alcoholic parents left Gregory with a lot of free time.
And he and his little buddies frequently would go on adventures, climbing cliffs. If there was a tree that he wanted to climb, he would invariably find the tallest tree, and to that you would add the fact that it would be on the side of a cliff, so he could climb as high as he could. He would do things like climb grain elevators and walk a beam from one grain elevator to the other over the railroad tracks, just to challenge himself and make himself sort of a hero amongst his young friends.
In the fall of 1919, a barnstormer in his surplus Jenny biplane flew into Gregory's little town. This was the first plane he had ever seen. Gregory, with one of his fellow first graders, convinced the pilot to give them a ride. Of all his flights, this one would always be remembered. As a young man, Gregory moved to Seattle, got married, and began working as a draftsman for the Boeing Corporation. He was quickly bored with his job and began looking for a way out. Ignoring the regulation that no Marine cadet could be married, Greg applied for training. While looking for his birth certificate, he learned that there was no record of a Greg Hallenbeck being born on December 4th, 1912. Finally, his mother confessed that he really was not Gregory Hallenbeck. She had divorced his father when he was very young. His real name was Gregory Boyington. The new name worked in Greg's favor. Officially, Greg Boyington was not married, and therefore eligible for Marine cadet training in Pensacola, Florida. Recruits who entered Pensacola in the 1930s received some of the finest flight training available. For Boyington, the flying was the only good part. Hiding his wife and children turned out to be an expensive endeavor. Cadets made little money. His unofficial family expenses and ever-growing bar tab proved too much to handle. Boyington was broke.
So that by the time World War II was starting to approach, he was financially very heavily in debt, and by now he had 3 children, and his marriage was on the rocks, and the situation was fairly gloomy. And he had been in some hot water with the Marine Corps, to the point that he could see the handwriting on the wall that he would be furloughed or cashiered fairly soon.
One night in the summer of 1941, Boyington went into the San Carlos Hotel in downtown Pensacola. He cashed a bad check for $20 and proceeded to the bar. Soon he learned that a recruiter upstairs was looking for fighter pilots for hire who would help defend the Burma Road against the Japanese. Boyington met with the recruiter and immediately saw a way out of his gloomy financial situation. Within a matter of days, Boyington steamed to Burma with the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers. For Boyington, the decision was easy. The pay was 3 times his Marine salary, and the Chinese government was giving a $500 bonus for each plane shot down.
Probably the Marine Corps were as glad to see him go as he was glad to be able to get away from his debts and other obligations.
In February 1940, Japan moved troops into Indochina and began expanding into China. Under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, China desperately sought ways to halt the Japanese aggression. The Chinese Air Force was not adequately equipped with modern aircraft, but it was fortunate to have serving as a military advisor Claire Chennault. Chennault, a retired Army captain and stunt flying team member, moved to China and assembled the American Volunteer Group. The American Volunteer Group was split into 3 squadrons. 1 squadron was sent to defend Rangoon, and 2 others were sent to southern China to defend the Burma Road. Immediately, the AVG successes stunned the Japanese and forced them to reinforce their squadrons operating in the Chinese theater. Though he contributed to the Flying Tigers' success, Boyington really never fit in. He was the man they left alone.
Boyington's reputation did precede him somewhat. He had this reputation as a boisterous, rowdy, two-fisted drinker amongst some of the Navy pilots who had gone ahead of him, Navy and Marine Corps both. And when he got there, a lot of that reputation played out.
First time I ever saw Pappy, Moose Moss and I were in this little town of Tungu, which is about 8 miles out of where our base was there in central Burma. And so we were in this little town there, and we heard this racket. We were rooting around somewhere there, and we heard this racket, and we jumped back kind of off the side of the road in a little kind of a path. And here comes this damn rickshaw. Pappy's pulling the rickshaw and got the coolie in the sitting in it, drunk as a goat, you know.
At times he would report to work the next morning and he wasn't capable of flying, and I was in operation, so I'd take him off the scramble list and take him off alert. Bob Neal finally got fed up with him, and things went from bad to worse.
Boyington left the Flying Tigers abruptly and without permission, angering Chennault and his fellow Tigers. He made his way to India.
Chennault fired a message to the Air Force in India denying Boyington air passage back to the United States. In fact, urging them to recruit Boyington into the Air Force as a second lieutenant. So Boyington bought passage with the hard-earned money that he had been paid on an American ship, the SS Brazil.
Although the Allies gained an edge in the Battle of Midway, Boyington learned upon his return home that it had been a disaster for the Marine Corps' fighter squadrons. The Marines had already lost a good number of their planes and top pilots at Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Wake Island. Boyington thought this critical need for Marine fighter pilots would guarantee his speedy return to service. He was wrong.
In the meantime, he went back to his home state of Washington, where his father and his mother lived. I should say his stepfather and his mother were living. And he waited for the Marine Corps to call him back to service. And he waited some more. He had 3 children to feed, and no work, and he ended up going to Seattle and working in a parking garage. During World War II, while everybody else was training or going overseas to fight, he was parking cars.
One night, Boyington took matters into his own hands. After drinking a bottle of bourbon, he sat down and wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox. Boyington claimed he was an ace with the Flying Tigers, and that all he wanted was to be reinstated in the Marine Corps so he could fight. To expedite matters, Boyington called Western Union and read his letter as a telegram to Washington, D.C. Remarkably, within a matter of days, Boyington was reinstated in the Marine Corps, now as a major, and once again went off to war. What his responsibilities would include, who knew, but at least he would be closer to the fight. Boyington soon found out flying was not part of his future. He was passed from one group to another, usually as an administrator. The few opportunities he had to command a squadron rarely involved flying time, and he did not encounter opposition from the enemy. This was not what Boyington had in mind. Finally, in desperation, he went to see an old friend, a senior officer named Sandy Sanderson. They came up with the idea of forming a fighter squadron by using pilots available in the replacement pool. Somehow, the idea got approval. Boyington was allowed to assemble together fighter pilots, and what would become the Black Sheep Squadron was formed.
When they formed the 214 around Boyington and we all got together, it was a comradeship, and it's hard to describe.
We had a pretty good cross-section of experience, so that, we weren't a bunch of new boys on the block, and I think that made it possible to weld together very quickly.
We had a good record in that Solomon's campaign, but I'm sure many of the other squadrons with whom we fought had comparable records. And sometimes you might think we won the war by ourselves.
We did.
The squadron fell under the leadership of Boyington and Frank Walton, the intelligence officer. Walton was the stabilizing force behind the squadron. A police officer in Los Angeles, Walton was tough enough to keep Boyington and the gang in line. Walton was also a dedicated writer who committed himself to keeping the families back home informed.
Walton, after you were all there at night, he'd be in the office and be writing press releases. And he'd send press releases to the Times-Picayune, where I lived in New Orleans. Man, my parents thought I was the biggest hero in the war.
I think that Frank was very compassionate, and I know that he agonized when a big flight would go off, 16 planes on a sweep over Bougainville or something like that. He was concerned that every single one of us get back.
Soon after the squadron was authorized and began their training, they decided that they needed their own identity and their own name. And because of the nature of their formation, that it was informal and that they had been brought from different units, some had experience, some didn't, the first name they hit on was Boyington's Bastard.
The day it was decided, we were all in a tent, or quite a few guys were in a tent, and we played around with Boyington's Bastard and kind of liked it. But then the PR guy that was with us said, you might do some good, and that wouldn't go too good in the press. And so they compromised and made a Bastard shield for us in order to keep the Bastard but not have it in print. And it served pretty well, and we liked it.
In heraldry, the stripe, the black stripe, is called the bar sinister, and it's a symbol of illegitimacy.
Though the Solomon Islands only fill a small part of the Pacific Ocean, their strategic location became critical for both the Japanese and the Allied forces. The United States Marines helped stop the Japanese advancement at Guadalcanal. The Allied strategy was to take the offensive and island hop from Guadalcanal towards Tokyo. When the Black Sheep arrived, the Japanese stronghold at Bougainville was under constant attack. Once captured, Bougainville would serve as a staging area for attacks against the Japanese fortress at Rabaul, which housed over 100,000 troops, 4 airstrips, and over 400 aircraft. Given the speed in which the squadron was put together, Boyington spent what little time he had explaining tactics and strategy to his men. Many of his pilots came with no combat experience, and only a few had flown together.
Pappy's explanation of how he wanted the squadrons to operate, how the divisions would operate, was standard. It was not strange. Everybody fell into it very nicely. We'd brief each other before we go up so that my wingmen knew what I was going to be doing and how my hand signals and so forth were going to work, and the same with the section, so that I never had a feeling that we were not a unit. I think that was the great thing about 214.
Boyington also spent time explaining the difference between the Marines' F4U Corsair and the Japanese Zero. "You're flying one of the sweetest fighters there is," Boyington once told his squadron. "But there are certain things a Corsair won't do." Boyington knew the Zero was nimble and could outturn the Corsair. The only way to win was to attack from above.
Boyington had learned fighter tactics while flying with the AVG, where they had learned that none of the American planes could turn inside the fighters that the Japanese had. The Zero and even the earlier predecessors to the Zero were incredibly nimble. They had lightning quick response. They could out-climb anything that the Americans could put in the sky. So they quickly learned the tactics to use were to get above the Japanese, use the superior weight of the American fighter, and come down on the enemy, open fire with a quick burst. And this is where the American fighters had a distinct advantage. With 6 heavy machine guns in the wings, they could just make a veritable buzzsaw of lead that would tear apart those lightly built Japanese planes.
With the knowledge they had managed to gain from Boyington and others in the squadron with experience, and with their Corsairs, the Black Sheep Squadron set out to leave their mark on history. On September 16, 1943, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Boyington and 23 Black Sheep took off for their 3rd combat mission. This would be a day to remember. The Black Sheep were escorting a bombing mission against a Japanese base on an island near southern Bougainville. As they approached the target, they met a powerful force of Japanese fighters. A dogfight ensued, and for 30 minutes, within 250 square miles of airspace, Zeros and Corsairs maneuvered against each other. On this day and many to come, the Black Sheep ruled the skies. They claimed 11 victories and another 8 probables. Boyington got 5 himself. The Black Sheep's success continued. Day after day, the squadron scored kill after kill. The fighting instincts of the squadron commander worked well with the pilots at hand. Boyington and his boys became known as one of the most aggressive and successful fighter squadrons in the region. But with these victories came the sad reality of losing a colleague. No one looked forward to the time when a death was officially recorded. Like all others stationed in the Solomon Islands, the Black Sheep dealt with military life in a jungle. Living on an undeveloped Pacific island was a difficult adjustment. Conditions were sparse, and as squadrons moved further up the islands and new bases were quickly established,
we just were always wet. And one of the things that bothered us is that we'd be in that flight suit for day after day and probably didn't rinse them out as often as we should. I was never terribly impressed with the gourmet cooking, although I really had no problem. I like Spam, I liked it then, I still like it, and I managed to handle powdered eggs, so that wasn't a real problem.
Miserable.
I thought the food was the worst problem. Yeah. Spam and Vienna sausage, and they rotated. One for breakfast, one for the other for lunch, and a third for noon. And then they'd repeat it, they would change it slightly the next day, and instead of having Spam for breakfast, you'd have Vienna sausage for breakfast.
However, life wasn't that bad. Mosquitoes, yes. Heat, yes.
You can put up with a lot when you're 20, 22 years old.
Sure.
Though his methods were often questioned, Boyington instilled an incredible sense of camaraderie in the squadron. He was able to meld the group into a unit. For a fighter squadron, trust among fellow pilots is absolutely essential.
I'm depending on my wingman to cover my tail while I cover his. And you can't do it if you have animosity against him. It just can't be done. And that goes for your second section. There, we're weaving, we're doing everything you can to protect each other while we're trying to get the enemy. And it all starts back on the base where you had to learn to live together.
Living with Pappy Boyington was challenging. He burned the candle at both ends, working all day and playing all night. At times, his drinking was uncontrollable.
I just said, Pappy has to have some kind of release, and this is it. It doesn't distract from what he's doing in the air, that's obvious. Although I wasn't one that joined into that myself. That's just the way it was, and life went on.
One of his characteristics is that when he drank, he frequently became belligerent. He was a fighter. He loved to wrestle. He didn't care who he fought, but he would frequently challenge somebody to a fight when he drank. Invariably, he picked the biggest guy around. This also extended to his skill as a pilot. He loved to fight. He was aggressive. It didn't matter if he was fighting his own people or fighting the Japanese. He had that fighting mentality.
One of our first meetings, we were sitting around after dinner, and Boyington said, "I'll fight anybody in the place." And turned his head to Frank Walton, who was a big, tough, old L.A. cop and our intelligence officer. He said, "Except Walton." And that is the way he fought. He fought to win, and he fought all the time. He loved it. He loved it. Thank God he did.
Boyington regularly demonstrated his fighting instincts in the air. Each time he climbed into a Corsair, his squadron knew what to expect. Find the enemy's weakness and attack.
Boyington would catch them taking off. That's when they were most vulnerable. The brass used to try to force the fighters to stay close to the bombers. And staying close to the bombers, you could fend off the attacking Zeros, Japanese, but you couldn't get a kill. They would pass through, rip off a few rounds at the bombers, and then dive out back towards Indian country. Boyington would carry the attack to the enemy planes, taking off, climbing out, when they were highly vulnerable.
Even the Japanese learned of Boyington's passion for fighting. On one particular fighter sweep over Bougainville, the Japanese decided not to come up when challenged by the American fighters. Boyington got mad and yelled over the radio, "Come on up and fight." To the surprise of everyone, the Japanese radio operator responded, "Why don't you come down, Major Boyington?" The third week in October saw the end of the Black Sheep's first tour. In just 6 weeks, the squadron scored 57 confirmed kills and another 19 probables. The Sheep were tired and in need of a break. They had listed 4 pilots missing or dead and sent 2 more away due to injuries. The remaining 22 were ready for some rest and relaxation in Sydney, Australia.
And then after each combat tour, which is usually around somewhere between 5 and 7 weeks, you'd go back to Espiritu Santos and they'd load you up on a bunch of DC-3s and they'd fly all night well, you stopped at New Caledonia and then down to Sydney, Australia.
When you landed, you immediately made a beeline for King's Cross, which was sort of the bohemian section of Sydney, and you found yourself starting off probably at the Red Cross Hostel and then working out from there to find some convenient place to call your headquarters.
The first time I was there, I stayed in the Royal Australian Hotel. I'll never forget that place as long as I live. Boyington was there too. We never saw him though, except at the parties at night. So I don't know what he did during the day, but he had fun. We all did.
The ground rules were such that it was pretty much open season. The Marines come into town, we'd find some delightful young lady to help us enjoy our rest and recreation. One of the great things about the Hotel Australia in downtown Sydney was it had a long mahogany bar, and the center section was reserved for Marines. Frida was the bartender behind that particular section.
There was this one Frida that everybody went to, and you'd line up in front of Frida before the bell rang, and you'd order, and she was allowed 1 bottle of scotch a night, if I remember. And you got there early, and you'd order 4 scotches, and she'd put the glasses out there with all the scotch and stuff in them. And then when the bell rang, you'd grab your drinks and poured them down as fast and went back and ordered some bourbon or whatever was there.
I can remember when we get ready to come back, we'd go by and buy a chicken that had already been cooked. We'd carry that back because flight rations on the way back were not exactly up to airline standards, so this would help us a great deal. So we'd usually eat the chicken and then sleep the rest of the flight.
The Black Sheep's return to combat began with a controversy surrounding their beer-filled luggage.
We carried our gear in a parachute bag, canvas parachute bag, and before taking off for resuming our flight back to the islands, we had to carry it in and have it weighed so they could figure in this non-flying officer there said, "You got too much weight," and we suspected he may have been looking for some of the beer that we were carrying back with us. Don't know, but we argued without success. Boyington argued without success, and then turned to us and said, "Drink the beer, boys," and we left the bottles.
Full of pleasures and memories of Sydney, the Black Sheep flew back to the Solomon Islands. They knew what lay ahead. The Allies had moved up the islands, and the final push to Rabaul was just beginning. New pilots were added to the squadron, bringing the total to 40. Boyington spent the first weeks explaining to the new pilots how the Black Sheep fought. Soon, word came that the squadron was returning to combat, but unfortunately, without Boyington. A longtime nemesis of Boyington, Colonel Joe Smoke, had transferred Boyington away from the fighting to a non-flying job. Smoke was military proper and did not approve of Greg Boyington. The two men detested each other. On Frank Walton's recommendation, Boyington went over Smoke's head and secretly visited an old drinking buddy, General James Moore, at headquarters. Moore could not argue with Boyington's success and granted him another combat tour.
And when Smoke learned of this, he was so incensed that he dredged up a very obscure regulation in which officers were not allowed to go to group headquarters on their own business. And using this regulation, Smoke had Boyington arrested and put him in hack for a couple of weeks, meaning that he was confined to his own quarters or to the environment of Turtle Bay airstrip. And he was not allowed to visit the clubs. And before the completion of his so-called sentence, Boyington got on a transport with several of his other pilots and just went to begin another combat tour.
During their second tour, The Black Sheep confirmed their suspicions regarding the importance of fighter strafing raids. Guns loaded with armor-piercing incendiary slugs could slice the forest and any Japanese hotspots in the way. The Black Sheep found themselves lending a hand to the ground Marines who were fighting intense Japanese opposition. The assistance was greatly appreciated. In reports filed by ground Marines, references to the irrepressible Black Sheep began to appear.
Well, at one time, I was sitting on a ready alert at the end of the runway in case some Japanese plane came in, and some of the ground Marines came out of the bush and were saying, in effect, you guys do the greatest job. What we were doing was firing at the guns that they had put up in the hills to pop down on us. He says, you are saving our lives, and I just can't believe what you're doing. And my answer to him was that we're in awe of you. We wouldn't anymore want to go back in the bush and fight the way you do. You do, both of us do, what we're trained for.
As Bougainville became secured, the Black Sheep knew that soon they would be fighting over the Japanese fortress at Rabaul. The Japanese were determined to maintain their position at Rabaul, because if it fell, then the only choice the Japanese had was to retreat to the Philippines. At Rabaul, the Japanese had 5 airfields full of aircraft ready to provide heavy opposition to Allied attacks. The Marines knew the casualty rate over Rabaul was going to be high. After being summoned to the Air Command headquarters, Boyington learned that he would be leading an 80-plane strike against Rabaul. This initial raid was disappointing for the Black Sheep because the Japanese were intimidated by the enormous size of the American force. They sent up only a few aircraft and kept the rest of the Zeros safely on the ground. During the next few weeks, the story was different. The Japanese were better prepared. Sortie after sortie, the Black Sheep applied pressure to the Japanese. They escorted numerous B-24 bomber runs, and they unleashed a series of Boyington's deadly fighter sweeps. The fighting was rough, and the casualties were high. In 1 week alone, the Black Sheep lost 6 pilots. As the squadron's number of kills increased, so did Boyington's personal tally. He was getting close to the all-time ace record.
The attention in the United States was focused on this so-called victory race. At the time, the leading ace of all of the American forces was Joseph Foss, who had scored 26 credited victories during the defense of Guadalcanal, mostly in 1942 and the first few weeks of 1943. So he was the leading ace with 26 victories. Boyington started to approach that number, and almost every time he went flying, the media would crowd around upon his return to find out how he had done that particular day.
As the story unfolded, more and more press arrived, wanting to cover the story of his record-breaking flight. Good news about the war was a rare commodity, and Boyington's story was every pressman's dream, a self-made man, an outsider, moving into sacred territory. Boyington was not as sure. As the squadron approached the end of the second tour and the number of days available to break the record became fewer, Boyington began doubting his chances. In a letter he wrote to his mom, Boyington confessed, "The Japanese are getting pretty tough out here. I don't know whether I will be able to break Joe Foss's record before I go home or not. As you have always taught me, nothing is worthwhile unless you earn it." Early in the morning on January 3rd, 1944, Boyington met his squadron on the airstrip at Torinquina. He had nothing to drink the night before and had slept well. On this day, Boyington was taking his sheep on a large fighter sweep of Rabaul. As they approached the coast, the Black Sheep met an enormous number of opposing Japanese planes. A dogfight ensued, and Boyington and his wingmen found themselves alone with at least 20 Zeros. Boyington did what he could. A number of Black Sheep witnessed Boyington shoot down a Zero, but then dramatically disappear. There was no sign of his wingman either. No one could believe what had happened. By afternoon, most people figured Boyington was not returning. Earlier, angry pilots had climbed into their Corsairs and gone looking for Boyington, shooting up anything Japanese along the way, but they found nothing. There was no story for the press, no happy ending. Major Boyington was gone. Perhaps Frank Walton expressed the loss of Boyington best when he wrote to his wife, "We all miss the skipper, but even more important than our personal loss is the loss to combat aviation. Someday I can tell you more, but he was the dean of all combat pilots. We loved him and respected him, and our boys were all willing to die for and with him. And some of them did, but I'm sure they considered it an honor to do so." For the next months, rumors spread like wildfire. There were claims that Boyington was alive, hiding in a jungle waiting for his men to pick him up. Others believed Boyington had taken a submarine home and was already back in the States. There was also a story that someone had found Boyington's Mae West life jacket riddled with bullet holes. Without their leader, the Black Sheep had little chance of remaining together. They were finished as a group. By January 9th, they had completed their second tour and were relaxing on Turtle Bay, enjoying swims during the day and movies at night. They would soon be disbanded and sent to different assignments. The Sheep had every reason to be proud of the squadron's performance. They were credited with 94 confirmed planes shot down, another 35 probably shot down, 50 aircraft damaged, and 21 destroyed on the ground. The total was 203 enemy planes destroyed or damaged. They had also lost 12 pilots while reaching this mark. The squadron's name and number was given to a new squadron training in the United States. This group was to be given little chance to continue the legacy created by the original Black Sheep. The role of a Marine fighter squadron had changed by the time the new Black Sheep were deployed. They now operated from carriers, and VMF 214 was stationed on the USS Franklin. Tragedy on a grand scale awaited the squadron. On March 19, 1945, the Franklin was within 100 miles of the Japanese coast. Before dawn, 12 Black Sheep departed for a fighter sweep, leaving the remaining pilots and crew on board. A single Japanese Judy dive bomber slipped through the radar and dropped 2 bombs on the deck of the Franklin. The carrier erupted. Rescues were made when they could be, but the intense fire and constant explosions prevented many attempts. 7 pilots were pulled from the water, and another 5 were declared missing. 26 squadron crew members were also dead. There was no reason to consider a future for the squadron. Those pilots who could still fly were sent to other squadrons, and the rest were sent home. The Black Sheep Squadron was disbanded and would not return for a number of years. As the war in the Pacific drew to a close, prisoners of war were being released, and as it turned out, some stray sheep were found. Major Gregory Boyington was alive and in good health at the Omori prison in Tokyo. On the day Boyington disappeared, he had jumped from his aircraft and was picked up out of the water by a Japanese submarine. He was taken from prison to prison and ended up in one outside of Tokyo.
And here the prisoners were put to work walking across the causeway every morning to clear the rubble from the streets after the B-29 raids the previous night. And again, they were underfed, they were often beaten. The Japanese performed experimental surgeries on certain prisoners, and it was a rough existence for all of them. But in August of 1945, a small fleet sailed into Tokyo Bay after the Japanese had surrendered. And Hal Stassen, who had been a former governor of Minnesota, was one of the first people to greet Greg Boyington and the other Amori prisoners. And then they were brought aboard a hospital ship, given delousing and showers and hot meals. And then eventually Boyington was flown back to the United States, where he received a hero's welcome.
Word soon spread that Pappy Boyington was alive.
Out in the Pacific, on one occasion, he said, if you see me shot down over a ball and bail and go smashing into the ocean, don't worry about it. I'll meet you at the Sir Francis Drake and have a drink after the war. And he made good on it.
The world listened to Pappy's incredible story.
Somehow or other, they found all the black sheep in the country, and the Marine Corps arranged transportation and flew us all out to San Francisco and put us up at the
St. Francis.
St. Francis. And they had a 3-day party there. I've still got a hangover from it.
After the party, the Marine Corps sent Boyington and Frank Walton on a cross-country tour selling war bonds. In every community he visited, Boyington received a hero's welcome, and in Seattle, the city closed the streets. The war bond tour ended with a visit to the White House, where Boyington was joined by fellow black sheep as he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor by President Truman, a fitting end to the black sheep's legacy. The black sheep today are reserved when asked to tell their history. As far as they are concerned, a Hollywood movie and a 1970s television series based on their experiences did not tell their story. What it was like to be 20-something years old, flying and getting shot at during the day, and sleeping in a jungle at night. So today the black sheep keep their story private. They know what they did, and they know why they did it.
Well, I don't think that special mention should be made of the black sheep. We were one of many squadrons who fought the War of the Solomons with some success, and it gave us great satisfaction because we developed under the pressures of flying combat friendships for which there is no replacement.
I'm proud of the squadron. I'm proud to have been a member of it, even for a short period of time.
I'm not going to apologize for the Black Sheep Squadron. It was a hell of a good outfit, great people, longtime friends, and we did our job, and we ought at least be credited with that. I will not take second place to anyone. Yeah, he made young men brave. He was a real leader in the air. The day it was decided, we were all in a tent, or quite a few guys were in a tent, and we played around with Boyington's Bastard and kind of liked it. But then the PR guy that was with us said, you might do some good, and that wouldn't go too good in the press. And so they compromised and made a Bastard shield for us in order to keep the Bastard but not have it in print. And it served pretty well, and we liked it.
In heraldry, the stripe, the black stripe, is called the bar sinister, and it's a symbol of illegitimacy.
How many pilots have you ever heard of who on their first combat mission in the Solomon Islands, where we were, shot down 5 planes? on one mission. Well, at one time, I was sitting on a ready alert at the end of the runway in case some Japanese plane came in, and some of the ground Marines came out of the bush and were saying, in effect, you guys do the greatest job. What we were doing was firing at the guns that they had put up in the hills to pop down on us. He says, you were saving our lives, and I just can't believe what you're doing.
But tactically, he was a very fine leader and inspiration with his own conduct in combat. Boyington would catch them taking off. That's when they were most vulnerable. The brass used to try to force the fighters to stay close to the bombers. And staying close to the bombers, you could fend off the attacking Zeros, Japanese, but you couldn't get a kill.
And we all got to work together to make this thing happen. And I think that was what inspired them most of all, just because he was a down-to-earth person and basically led by example in the airplane. Soon after the squadron was authorized and began their training, they decided that they needed their own identity and their own name. And because of the nature of their formation, that it was informal and that they had been brought from different units, some had experience, some didn't, the first name they hit on was Boyington's Bastards. And when Smoke learned of this, he was so incensed that he dredged up a very obscure regulation in which officers were not allowed to go to group headquarters and on their own business. And using this regulation, Smoke had Boyington arrested. And here the prisoners were put to work walking across the causeway every morning to clear the rubble from the streets after the B-29 raids the previous night. And again, they were underfed. They were often beaten. The Japanese performed experimental surgeries on certain prisoners, and it was a rough existence for all of them.
First time I ever saw Pappy, Moose Moss and I were in this little town of Tungu, which is about 8 miles out of where our base was there in central Burma. And so we were in this little town there, and we heard this racket. We were rooting around somewhere there, and we heard this racket, and we jumped back kind of off the side of the road in a little kind of a path. And here comes this damn rickshaw. Pappy's pulling the rickshaw and got the coolie in sitting in it, drunk as a goat, you know.
At times, he would report to work the next morning, and he wasn't capable of flying, and I was in operation, so I'd take him off the scramble list and take him off alert. Bob Neal finally got fed up with him, and things went from bad to worse.
Walton, after you were all there at night, he'd be in the office, and he'd be writing press releases. And he'd send press releases to the Times-Picayune where I lived in New Orleans. Man, my parents thought I was the biggest hero in the war.
I think that Frank was very compassionate, and I know that he agonized when a big flight would go off, 16 planes on a sweep over Bougainville or something like that. He was concerned that every single one of us get back.